All right, thank you very much. I'm back. So, as I said yesterday in my presentation, I'm a core developer in the Django project. I've been a core developer since January of 2006, and I'm the current president of the Django Software Foundation. And I'm here today to, apparently, when I was proposing talks to Maria about what I could potentially speak about at this conference, she told me that there was a lot of interest in where Django was going, what was next on the roadmap. So this is my attempt to sort of give an idea of where Django might be going in the future, both the near future and the long-term future. To sort of, and in terms of the long-term future, look at what I see as the challenges for Django as a project in this big wide world of the internet. So before we talk too much about the future though, it's worth having a bit of a quick look at how far we've come. It took 3 years to get from our original public release to 1.0. In that period we had the magic removal change, we had the introduction of new forms and new forms admin, we had a massive internal refactor of query sets. And then September 2008 we had version 1.0, and since then we've averaged about one release per year. Django 1.1 added aggregates, proxy models, deferred fields, admin actions, URL namespaces. Django 1.2 added multiple database support, model validation, messages, object permissions. Django 1.3 added class-based views, logging and static files. Django 1.4 added time zone support, better support for WSGI, and a class-based form wizard. And we've been that's a lot of features to be adding over a course of almost 5 years at this point. We've been able to do that mostly with fairly well controlled backwards incompatibility. I can't say absolutely that all the code that ran on 1.0 would continue to run on 1.5 unmodified, but it's pretty close, and the 2 or 3 big changes are reasonably easy to make and mechanical to make. We've also managed to do it with a fairly clean security record, says I'm looking for a very large piece of wood to knock on. The big problems, things like CSRF and cross-site scripting and SQL injection, all the stuff that's on the top 10 list for the OWASP project, they're all essentially under control. If you use Django the way it's intended, your site will be out of the box protected against the most common forms of attack that exist on the internet, or that are common on the internet. Compare that with something like PHP, where almost none of those sites are, unless they're actively aware of the problems, they aren't being protected. The reason I raise all this is because just to point out that we have come a very long way. Django 1.0 and Django 1.5 are quite different beasts, although they are very, very similar. A lot of features have been added, and a lot of the things that are in Django today are there directly because of the feedback we've got from guys like you and the users in the real world who have real world usages of Django and have been pushing what they need and you need to make Django a great thing. So we've also managed to do that essentially on the back of volunteers. We have had people like Jacob and Adrian originally who were being paid to work on Django at the Journal World, but since then there really hasn't been anybody who's been actively paid to work on Django. It's been all done by volunteers, the patches have been done by volunteers, the commits have been done by volunteers, the community's been managed by volunteers. So we've done all of this with very little direct financial assistance. The financial assistance that we have had has been very useful in stimulating community events, but it hasn't gone directly to engineering. So what's next? Well, Django 1.5 RC2 came out on Tuesday last week, and I can say with absolute certainty a certain number of features will be in Django 1.5 because they're already in the codebase. We will have custom user models. So you have, since Django 1.0, since before Django 1.0, there has been the contrib application, the contrib auth application, which has had in it a user model which says that you must have a username that is 30 characters and doesn't contain punctuation, and an email address that is 75 characters. This is something that's been on the wish list forever. Almost since I started using Django, I can remember conversations happening on the mailing list saying, I want to be able to log in using my email address. How do I do this? Ticket 3011 is essentially, this is my big contribution for 1.5. We can now specify that I want to have this model as my user model, and this model uses the email address as the login, and it doesn't have a a staff field for checking whether or not someone is staff. Everyone is just assumed to be a staff member. And we also want every user to have a date of birth field. So you can start to define your own definition of what a user is to your system and have Django adapt to that in a fairly transparent way. The other really big thing that's come in Django 1.5 is this is our first release that supports Python 3 in any sort of official capacity. Python 3 has always been a long-term plan as far as the Python ecosystem has evolved. Django has been very late to this party, but mostly because Django depends upon lots of other pieces to exist. There's no point having a Python 3 compatible version of Django if there's no database adapter that can also talks Python 3. We still don't have a MySQL adapter that works in Python 3, but we do have Postgres and we do have SQLite. So what we reached a point where essentially Django was the bit that was holding everyone else up, and so we've put the effort in and actually made this happen. When I say we, I mean mostly I'm Eric Augustine and Bud Poroz and a group of people that were helping them. We've also added streaming responses. This is another long-standing ticket, not quite as long as custom user models, but it now means that a Django response can be essentially a generator or an iterator generating content continuously rather than having to compose the entire response and return it in one big hit. So there's all sorts of potential applications for that, ranging from, if you're serving large files, you don't have to load the entire file into memory in order to serve it, down to things like streaming events, potentially you could use it for as well. And most notably, for me anyway, for one thing that's sort of a bit of embarrassment that we've now managed to resolve. When I first downloaded Django in November of 2005, I did 4 pages of the tutorial, and at the bottom of page 4 of the tutorial it said, "Coming soon, more tutorials." Well, soon has happened, and we have more tutorials. There've been a lot of contributions, a lot of improvements to Django's documentation in general. Timo has been doing a lot of work in integrating patches and improving the documentation for this release. Okay, so unfortunately, that's the end of everything that I can say with absolute certainty. Django, like I said, is a volunteer project. So I can't, or anyone else in the core team can't compel anyone to do anything. And we can't hold out, the carrot and the stick. We can't use a stick because there's no point punishing someone. Hey, you didn't give us your free time. Well, they're a bad contributor. That doesn't actually make anyone want to contribute. So essentially, I'm limited in what I can say with absolute certainty about what is coming in the future. I can make predictions about what I think is going to come, but even when it comes to my own work, those predictions are only as good as the fact that I don't get a phone call next week that says that I have to spend all of my time working on something else. It's also, everything that I'm saying here is not a formal roadmap that I've discussed with the core team. I mean, I have conversations with the core team continuously about various bits and pieces and directions we think things are going and the importance of one feature versus another feature. But I'm sure that if this was ever to come to a formal discussion with the core team, some people on the core team would disagree with me in terms of whether this is going to happen or whether it should happen at all, or even just the relative priority of whether we should pay attention to feature A or feature B. All I'm really offering here is an insight as a long-standing member of the Django core team of what I see as the pieces that are missing and what as a community I think we need to be paying attention to in the long term to make sure that Django has a long and prosperous future. What actually ends up happening could be entirely different. Now, as a case in point, it's worth reflecting upon a recent success to sort of see why this sort of thing happens, why features may not actually roll out the way you think. Custom user models is an exercise in taking a long way. The idea was essentially first proposed almost as soon as Django was open sourced. The idea that I want to have an email address as a login, 75 characters is not enough to hold an email address, have been discussed actively on the mailing list since 2005. Formally, it was not proposed as a ticket or as an idea until November of 2006 when ticket 3011 was opened. But as soon as that ticket was open, that was really just someone saying, hey, I want to fix this, here's a patch. The catch is that there have been at least 5 that I can count, and probably a bunch others that I haven't been able to find in a quick search of the archives. At least 5 full attempts at implementing this feature that just didn't quite get off the ground for various reasons. I have had at least 2 major several-hour discussions with other members of the core team at Django cons, at sprints, just trying to work out what would be an acceptable solution, what can we live with, what can't we live with. So the reason that it got done this time is that I've had a series of conversations that got me to a point where I thought, hey, I can see there's a solution here that's actually quite simple and hopefully won't offend too many people. And so I started to really drive the process. In January of 2012, January of last year, I sat down and I wrote a wiki page in Django's wiki summarising the state of the debate. Here are all the ideas that have been put together. This is the strengths and weaknesses of each one. Okay, BDFLs, have at it. Which one of these are we going to do? Either put up or shut up, we're going to do one of these, or we're going to close down the ticket and say we're not going to do it ever. And that discussion went for a little while before the BDFLs really got involved. When they did, they made a decision, and then about 2 days later made a different decision, and luckily we've now stuck with the second decision. Now, it's also important to note, and I think Jacob would like this on the record, he informally, and I'd like to call him out as this to make a formal bet, he said that in 2 years' time we're going to regret adding this feature. Because he's been burnt by what this is trying to do before. If you go back into Django's deep dark past, there was this feature called replaces module, which essentially allowed you to say, take this block of code, this model, this piece, and replace it with this other block of code. And whilst that sounds really cool, it caused so many headaches it wasn't funny. So Jacob and Adrian and a number of other people in the core team have somewhat of a reservation about giving people the power to dynamically switch out things from underneath you. So it's fine to be able to say, hey, have all these models, but the problem is with something like auth, it becomes so integrated that you have to have everything pointing at it. So if you want to have any sort of permission-based system in your database, you need to say, well, all these objects relate to this user in some way. But if you don't know what user is, because it can be changed, then you have to be very careful about what you promise, and you have to start getting into all sorts of contracts for what must a user do or mustn't a user do. And once the developer has said this is the user we're going to do, you have to pray that they don't ever change it, because all the foreign keys are going to completely break and polarity ensues. So the reason it took a long time is that it took a very long time for us to come up with a solution that was going to be acceptable and wasn't going to sort of bring about post-traumatic stress for Jacob and Adrian, having seen how this sort of thing can go badly before. Now, as an interesting exercise to the reader, have a look, if you've got the time and the inclination, have a look at the way that we actually have implemented this feature, because there's actually a second hidden feature in there, which is part of the condition for 3011 being accepted was that we wouldn't document the second feature. It's an unofficial feature which hopefully some enterprising people in this audience and enterprising people in the Django community will play around with it and sort of see what the long-term consequences of that feature are. So if you're looking for some entertainment, go have a poke around the implementation, have a look at the patch. It should be fairly obvious. The way that Django custom user models work can be exploited in other ways for other models. I will leave it at that, and I'll be interested to see if anybody... We want essentially to see the people in the community who can work out how the feature works to tell us whether or not it's going to cause other problems if we make that a formal feature. So it's up to you guys to sort of say, hey, this thing, let's actually document it. Okay, so one of the best ways to predict the future is to look at what's missing. Django says on the box that it's for perfectionists with deadlines. What's preventing perfectionists from getting their job done today? Jacob has made the comment to me, I can't remember if it was a public conversation or it was a private conversation, that good frameworks don't come from academia, something to that effect. They come from extracting use cases from commercial projects, because academia, it's very easy to get into this wild arm-wavy discussions about what might be a good architecture, where commercial projects have to get something done. And that pressure, those constraints lead to better architectures, lead to better designs. Django and Rails and Ruby on Rails are both very good examples of this in practice. They were both extracted from live projects that were being used by companies for actual business. And as a result, they've both stood up as being very, very useful, productive frameworks for the long term. And that's sort of also, it's a good a guide going forward for what was likely to end up in Django. Practical solutions that are being used in action are a lot more likely to get attention than sort of abstract theories about what might be a good idea, and architecture astronauting and things like that. Now the catch is that fundamentally we've got a very good base toolkit. There's always room for improvement, there's always room for optimization, but working implementations of all the major parts exist, and we have proof that it works because there are so many large companies, large organizations searching very large websites using Django, as well as, on the same code base, very small websites being developed quickly for little internal skunkworks projects and their people's little home blogs and things like that. So it's spanned a wide range of usage in practical usage with the code we have right now. So you can't just say Django can't be used because it doesn't have this extra feature, because it is being used without those features. What we're looking at now is what little features can we add that will make Django better or make Django more adaptable to the future that's coming. There's also a big question here about, does it actually need to be in Django at all? There are features that would be great in a Django project that don't need to be in Django's core to be successful. We are reaching the point in Django's core where the best thing we can do is say, no, we're not going to put that in core, we're going to put that behind an API so that somebody else can support it, and then other people can work against that API and come up with better implementations. So a lot of the features that people may want to see in Django probably won't be added to Django itself. Okay, but we're not perfect. There are still some pain points in Django development, and it's a reasonable bet that those pain points are where the development focus for Django 1.6, 1.7, and the future, where that focus will lie. The most likely predictions are the ones where designs and prototype patches already exist. So just as a sort of a mark in the sand, the further I get away from this slide, the less accurate my predictions are going to get. I'm starting with the near-time predictions because it's very easy to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen next week. First off, the app refactor. This is, again, a very long-standing ticket which has stuck on a hurdle of exactly what does it mean. What is an app in Django? It's thrown around as reusable apps is one of Django's great strengths, but we've never really had a formal definition of what an app is. Now, what does this mean in practical terms? Well, it's not just a matter of saying we need to have something there. There are serious actual problems here. Where do I put my application startup logic? You know, what is application startup logic? So things like your signal handlers. Where do you register a signal handler to make sure that it doesn't get registered twice? At the moment, you have to be very, very careful that you don't accidentally double import your models module, because then you'll get multiple signal handle registrations. Something that's probably quite relevant to this audience. How do you translate the name of your app? At the moment, you essentially rely upon the module name, and that's what appears in the admin when it gets rendered. You all speak Russian. Your Python module name is probably not the best thing to be having in a user-facing interface. So where do you put that translation? We don't really have a good answer for that at the moment. There's also some more subtle questions, though. Django doesn't currently provide a guaranteed load order. This is an edge case that doesn't often pop up, but it is possible under certain circumstances to get different behaviour depending upon whether or not you run validate or not before you run before the code starts running. And that matters because the development server runs validate, but another WAD whiskey by default it doesn't. So we need to get some sort of rigor to make sure those problems don't happen. The app refactor essentially is an attempt to fix this. It introduces a wrapper class. So instead of just relying upon the existence of a models.py, it uses the existence of a class that declares what your app is, which then gives you a handle to put in things like my translations or my startup sequence or what else do I need to register, things like that. And that also means we can clean up a bunch of things like the admin auto-discovery of other modules, because the admin can now know what the other apps are and find their URLs easily. Now, the patch for this is almost ready. It was almost ready for 1.5, but because we were trying to land custom user models at the same time, we just decided, no, we're not going to get this in, we won't rush it, we'll wait at least until the next release to get it in. The code hasn't really been looked at for a couple of months. Please go and have a look at it if this is something that sounds interesting to you. The more feedback we get about how this does or doesn't solve a problem, whether it breaks your existing code, this is feedback we need to make sure that it's not going to break everyone when it goes public in 1.6. Schema migration is another really big one. It is an obvious hole that Django doesn't have built in a schema migration tool, because it's so fundamental to the act of developing a web application that it's bordering on embarrassing that Django doesn't have an out-of-the-box solution. I mean, I started Django Evolution several years ago in an attempt to sort of solve this problem. That didn't get as much traction. South came along from Andrew Godwin, and South has pretty much won that battle, but it still isn't part of core. Now, this also has some very practical implications for Django itself. There are lots of bugs in Django that hinge upon ideas like make the maximum length for this field larger. Email field by default is 75 characters. 75 characters is not enough. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's not enough characters to store every possible email address that is legal under the RFC. So why don't we just increase email field to 254 characters? Because we can't. Because if we did that, we'd break every other system that's in existence. Because in order to roll out that change, we have to put a line in our release notes that says you need to run an alter table statement that is appropriate for your database, which is the one guarantee you've got. Is if there's an instruction that absolutely must be followed by everybody, that is the one instruction that will never be read. So we need to have an automated mechanism to allow that to happen easily. And if we've got schema migrations in core, then those sort of things we can basically say, as part of a sync DB, we automatically run migrations, or as part of a version update, we automatically run migrations, and we can fix those problems. What will it look like? Well, that's a good question, because we're still waiting on the final version of the code. We know that it's going to look somewhat like South. There's still a slightly evolving target. The original proposition about 12, 18 months ago, when Andrew Godwin first started looking at this, was essentially to say, we're going to break it into two halves. There's the part that is database dependent, sort of the database API for changing a Django table. And then there's the front end for how you call those tables, or how you call those migrations, construct those migrations. And we were going to keep the two parts separate. Since then, it's sort of evolved a little bit. We may end up actually putting a little bit of that sort of user interface, publicly usable user interface, as part of what ships with Django. We have to watch to see what happens. Andrew needs to spend a bit more time writing code. And again, this is an area where if you want to help out, go jump on the South mailing lists and help Andrew get to the finish line. Composite 5 primary keys. This is a really big one for database administrators. Django's ORM enforces some design patterns which gives well-trained voice cod database administrators nightmares and what have you. So we need to have the ability to represent composite keys in Django's models and to reflect that into the database and be able to query across them and have those queries reflected in the admin and so on and so on. Now, this is something, again, where patches exist. This started as a Summer of Code project a couple of years ago, and the problem is that it's deceptively simple. At a conceptual level, it's easy to say, yes, we need primary keys, and this is what the API should look like in models. But then you follow all the details through and it starts getting really messy. So this is an area where, again, there is a patch, there is a branch you can look at to play around with that. Hunt down the conversations on Django Dev, you'll be able to find the branches. We need people to help sort out the devil in the details to make sure these things do work in admin. The other thing we need to be careful of here is that opening something like composite primary keys has the potential to become a giant tarball that just keeps rolling and rolling, picking up extra features. Because a many-to-many table currently has an integer primary key, which is a performance problem on certain databases, and really gives database admins nightmares because you've got this primary key that isn't primary. So what we really should be doing is using a composite primary key to represent many-to-many tables, but then we introduce a whole problem about migrations, and so on and so on. Generic foreign keys are another example where they could potentially be looked at as just an application of composite keys. They're not composite primary keys, but they are composite keys. So we also need to look here at where do we draw the line in terms of just getting this feature out the door. One of the features that I think we're going to see going forward is an increase in the amount of decoupling of Django into small parts. In 1.5, local flavor is essentially becoming a series of external applications, mostly so that to be, so that I'm not the person who is responsible for the Russian translation in Django. This is not something you want. We need domain experts who understand local Russian conditions to be managing the local flavour for Russia. We need to divest packages out into the community. So markup is another example where this is happening, mostly because we've discovered over time that the managers of the markup libraries aren't keeping on top of security issues, and because those libraries have issues, Django has issues, so we need to come up with a way of getting those problems controlled. Other contrib packages, effectively all of contrib, is potentially a candidate for being locked out or being pushed out of the core of Django, still being official Django projects in some way, depending on varying degrees. We possibly might draw the line at something like auth and sessions because they are so fundamental to the idea of what a website is. But even things like admin could potentially be a completely separate project, not part of Django's core itself. Why would that be a good thing? Well, it means we can decouple the release cycle of admin from the release cycle of Django. We can give the commit bit to someone who wants to play with admin as an application, rather than it being part of Django. And it also means that we have an excuse to try and convince people to start using better packaging tools. The reason Django's admin is, all these pieces are locked into Django's core at the moment is because in 2005, the packaging landscape in Python was positively abysmal. It's a lot better now. It has a long way still to go. And I think Django is in a position to be able to say, okay, we've got some serious real-world use cases of what packaging needs to do. Let's get the Python community as a whole to look at these problems, not just as Django problems, but as Python problems, and see if we can evolve the state of packaging to make it easier for everyone to use. Now, to allay any fears, we're not going to race into this. We're not going to pick up something and rip out all of contrib just because we can. You know, Django is popular. One of the reasons Django is popular is because it is easy to use. We're not going to sacrifice that first user experience for the sake of purity of a packaging approach. Whatever we do, we're going to make sure that it is still a very clean transition, a very easy system to maintain. Django's admin, speaking of, has always been a major drawcard for Django, but it is starting to get a little bit long in the tooth. It looks a little bit like it was developed in 2005, because it was. But it's not just visual. You know, there are features that people have wanted in admin that are possible to put in, but not easy to put in, and they're certainly not as easy as they should be. It's not just a matter of saying, let's redesign admin in Bootstrap. There are fundamental architectural features that need to be added. Things like Django's admin doesn't currently have anything remotely resembling a view permission, which it kind of needs to now. Back when admin was developed, it was designed to be used by trusted users, and we didn't have per object permissions. Now we do. So you can see a list of objects, but not necessarily be able to edit all of those objects. But there's no permission to reflect the fact that you can see the object without editing it. There's also an extent to which admin doesn't eat our own dog food. We introduced class-based views. The class-based views actually fix a bunch of bugs that are known to exist in admin that we've just kind of ignored. Architecturally, the class-based views framework looks the way it does because we are aware of problems that can exist in admin. We've avoided them in admin and we've fixed the problems in admin. But what we really should be doing is building admin in our own class-based view framework. And this is really, so what happened, how do we get admin with 2.0? Well, there is a regular sort of a recurring ping that occurs, a heartbeat message that occurs in the Django mailing list. It's about, when's admin 2.0 going to happen? It comes every couple of months, someone will post that message. It will happen when someone needs it, when someone really wants it. And the sad thing is at the moment is that admin, as it currently stands, is good enough for most people. There is an opportunity here for someone as a third-party project to really drive this and build a new great admin, which, because of this new packaging thing I'm talking about, it doesn't need to be in Django's core. It can be a great external admin application for Django sites, which everyone switches over to and uses, and then we just kind of quietly deprecate the one that's built into Django. So, we need someone who actually really wants this to make it happen. It's not a small project, and we need someone who's going to stick at it long term. And we also need to be aware here of second system problems. The classic problem of we've got admin, it works, someone sits down to build a better admin, and they, 4.5 years later they emerge from the tar pit and they've still only got a half-finished solution. The other big change that I foresee in the near, not too distant future is actually procedural. So the development procedure is in Django. Since Django 1.0, Django has averaged about one release a year. I think the time may have come to revisit this. And we've talked about this internally in the core team regularly. The problem being that we've sort of never really followed through on the discussions we've been having. But we have made one major change in 1.5 that helps make this easier. Prior to 1.5, when we got to a beta stage, which stage we would have a trunk freeze, and we would not accept any new features into Django's trunk repository until we finalised that release. What that effectively meant is if someone came along the day after 1.4 beta and said, I've got a great new feature that solves all the world's problems, we would say, thanks, come back in a couple of months. Which is, the observation has been made that that is an impediment to people actively contributing. So what we've done in 1.5 is branched rather than freezing the trunk. When 1.5 beta was released, we branched off, and all of the bug fixes for 1.5 release for the release candidate have been going into the branch and been and then ported into the main tree, which means that essentially 1.6 is already under development. There are a bunch of features that are in 1.6 that have already been committed to the tree and won't appear in 1.5. And now the argument for doing this is essentially to maintain developer momentum. You're never in a state where you won't accept an improvement to Django. The downside to it is that it means the developer focus is now split between, hey, this new shiny feature, and the really boring thing of getting a release out the door. And that's now something that we have to manage as a community. It also means that essentially once 1.5 is out the door, we are potentially in a position to freeze 1.6 and start the release process for 1.6, which means we can move to a much faster release cycle. So rather than waiting a year for the next release, maybe we only have to wait 3 months, which means that new features get into the wild a lot faster, but it also affects our backwards compatibility policy. Because if we're releasing a patch every 3 months, it means that the one version of stable, one version of security releases, you only have 6 months to update before we stop supporting the version you're using, which is a big change from the essentially 2 years that people have historically had. So we need to have a look at how we're going to manage that, and something like a long-term support releases is probably what's going to end up happening. Singleton cleanup is another thing that's likely, I think, at some point to be looked at, and the issue is how do we do it without breaking everyone's code. Django has one big mother of a singleton, the settings object, which makes a whole bunch of things really, really complicated. Alex Gaynor gave a really good talk about this at DjangoCon 2012 in the US. I'm not completely on board with the solution that he proposed, but I will completely agree the problem he described is real and we need to address somehow. The question is how. The obvious way to fix this problem is to go and have a big backwards compatible break. And it's been risky enough for Python 3 to do that. I don't know if it's necessarily something that Django wants to follow. Because we risk, if we have a backwards compatible break of the size and scope of the Python 3's was, we run the risk of scaring people to other frameworks. And Python is a much bigger community than Django is, even though Django is a large community. There are enough other options that we might end up scaring people away. And the continuity of the project is something we need to keep in mind of. Okay, so that's about as far as my crystal ball goes with specific predictions. My long-term predictions are more about trends and challenges rather than specific features that I think we're going to see in Django. One thing that I think we're likely to start seeing is better sharing with the rest of the Python world. This is partly something that I'd like to see and partly something that I think we need to see. It's also something that I think is going to be very difficult to manage. Over time, like when I was talking yesterday, I spoke about all the thousands of web frameworks that existed when Django came into existence. Most of those have now died off. But what we've been left with is a couple of very, very strong contenders who are all fundamentally at some level doing very, very similar things. Now, Django has a wrapper, a WSGI layer, a WSGI wrapper that implements that whole kind of interface. So does Pyramid. Does the Python community benefit from having 2 WSGI interface layers being used in production, having our development effort being split across 2 different toolkits? There is an argument to be made that one of us should cry uncle and use the others. And, I it's not necessarily an absolute given, but I think there would be value in us exploring how much Django could start being a better behaved part of the broader Python ecosystem and start using parts of other frameworks or start using other libraries that are being used in other parts of the Python ecosystem. Django has been historically tagged as a not invented here prone framework, and mostly I think that's really, really unfair on Django. People say that Django didn't use SQL Alchemy. Why doesn't Django use SQL Alchemy? Well, it didn't use SQL Alchemy because SQL Alchemy didn't exist when we built the ORM. We built one because SQL Alchemy didn't exist. So that's why we're in the situation we are in. That's why Django has its own parts. But that's not ultimately a long-term tenable solution. At some point you need to say, okay, yeah, we've got two. Are we actually as a community benefiting from having two? Speaking of, as early as 2006, there have been discussions, and even a branch in Django's repo, attempting to integrate Django with SQL Alchemy. There have been several proposals since then to try to replace parts of Django's internal querying infrastructure with parts of SQL Alchemy. Now, we're not saying that Django's ORM is going to go away. We like our ORM, we like the metadata that is there. What we're trying to do is say, okay, well, SQL Alchemy is a very, very rich project for expressing SQL, which is an area that Django has some weaknesses. And building queries is hard. And if Mike Bayer wants to take on his job of making that work well, let's let him. And exploit, well, not exploit is the right way to put it, let's use all his skills and use all the skills of the Django community to help him make SQL Alchemy better, and then we both get better as a whole. So Django would lose the overhead of maintaining a single query engine, SQL Alchemy would gain a whole bunch of users, hopefully the community as a whole would benefit. Would this be a good thing? Maybe. Is it going to be an easy thing? Absolutely not. But it's something that is at least worth exploring so we can rule it out whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. One reason why it might be a bad idea is NoSQL. Django is very specifically an ORM, an object relational mapper. And the idea is that the API that you get through Django is of objects, not of SQL. SQL Alchemy is the exact opposite. It is a model for building SQL queries. So the one thing that SQL Alchemy can't do is integrate with a NoSQL store. Now, we have a theoretical branch in Django that would use Django's query syntax to integrate with non-relational stores, in particular Mongo, but in principle others as well. So does that mean that we're going to start seeing NoSQL support in Django? Well, again, that's a definite maybe. Alex Gaynor's Summer of Code branch pointed out there are actually some fairly fundamental problems that we need to resolve. They're not unsolvable problems, but they're going to require a BDFL judgment about what we are or aren't going to do to solve these problems. And at least in the core teams, the enthusiasm for NoSQL has kind of died off. We've come to the conclusion, most of us have come to the conclusion that if you just use Postgres right, you kind of don't need a lot of NoSQL. At least for the sort of things that people are trying to say we're going to have an object relational mapper for MongoDB anyway. So does that mean that we're not going to get NoSQL support? Well, not necessarily. It sort of depends a little bit on what you think NoSQL support means. There's an extent to which NoSQL support in Django really means I want my MongoDB objects to appear in the admin. And all to do that, all you need for that is a really simple API layer that sort of is consistent between the two. You don't need to have deeply embedded queries and any arbitrary Django filter chain can be turned into a MongoDB query and things like that. You read really simple CRUD operations and that's about it. Now, okay, these are really big code changes and big cultural changes, but they're really just really minor evolutions in kind of where Django is at the moment. They're not things that concern me or keep me up late at night. What concerns me as a core developer is the extinction level events, the really massive changes that you don't see coming that cause you to completely be irrelevant so quickly it's not funny. 2005, Zope was the big player in the Python web space. And in 2004, there was 2005, there was a massive explosion of Python web frameworks that showed there were better ways of building web servers, or there were better ways of building web applications. Now, Zope has adapted, there was Grok, there's Repos BFG, which kind of turned into pylons, which turned into pyramids. So Zope's legacy lives on today, but Zope isn't the project that it once was, and certainly hasn't had the influence that it once had. Django was a great solution for the web circa 2005. what's the solution? What do we need to be concerned about in the future? What's Django's extinction event going to be? The web industry today is very different to what it was 7 years ago, and I think we have at least some areas where there's cause for concern. Now, cringing, real time. I come from a physics background, so I have a real issue with this word real time when applied to the web, but I'll take a deep breath and work through it. Django doesn't have, at the moment, a good answer for the real-time web. The best examples, the best answers that I've heard to these sort of solutions end up using a very small Node.js server to do the real-time stuff tied to a Redis store that's still using a message queue to pass the things back and forth. And that works. It's worked really well on a couple of applications, but it's not a great answer. If we're going to be, the modern web is real-time. It does have updates continuously. We need to have a solution in this space. There's also, it's becoming increasingly clear that the separation that Django has maintained between server and client is not something we can maintain long term. Django has always said, we are a server-side framework. What you do on the client side is up to you. But these days, Meteor is making it obvious, very obvious, that you can't make that distinction. You need to have a very tight integration between the client and the server, because the client needs to know things about what's going on your server and vice versa. And even at a lower level than that, we kind of need to get to a position, in order to do rich web, or rich interfaces, you kind of need to be able to say, Django's using jQuery and we can rely upon its existence. So this is a big cultural change that Django as a project needs to take on. And if we want to survive in this modern web space, we need to have an answer here. And of course, this means dealing with JavaScript, facing up to harsh choices. When JavaScript is the only viable language that exists in a web browser, well, how does Python play with that? If you need to have model validation logic in the browser, do you double implement it? Double implement it in Python, implement it in JavaScript? Well, you can, but then that's an engineering overhead. And the first thing that happens is someone comes along with a framework like, for example, Meteor, that allows you to use the same logic on both. Is that going to be the compelling thing that makes Django irrelevant? The fact that you have to double implement everything just to get it to work? Now, there are options of things like CoffeeScript allows you to compile a Python-like language into JavaScript, but it's never going to be completely native, because you're trying to write Python, in this case, a Ruby-like, Python-like language that in its idiom into JavaScript idiom, which means you're going to lose performance. And you're not targeting a low-level assembler here. You're targeting a high-level language, which is itself targeting a low-level assembler. So there's always going to be sort of performance issues that are inherent there. Now, this isn't just a Django problem either. This is an open question for the Python community, because we're getting to a place where the only place Python can be used is on the server, but the server is not the only place you need to write code anymore. A similar challenge in mobile. You can't write Python code for mobile at the moment, or at least I haven't seen a good solution that anyone's actually using in practice. You have to either write Objective-C for iOS, or Java for Android, or JavaScript if you're using a PhoneGap wrapper. We don't have a good story for Python in the mobile space. Now, that doesn't mean Python can't be used. There's Kiva that proves that you can have frameworks on mobile that are written in Python. PyObjective-C and Jython prove that you can use Python as a language that talks to different backends or different object models. RubyMotion shows that you can use Ruby to write directly to a sort of an Objective-C API. Ximian proves it's possible to use a single language platform to support multiple platforms. But none of those solutions really are about Python. They're all about other languages that people like. So we have a problem here as a Python community, not just a Django community, about what do we do about mobile. And to finish up, we have one last cultural challenge. How do we make all this stuff happen? I don't know if any of you are fans of an American TV show called The West Wing. There's an episode right at the end of season 1 of The West Wing where the president stands up and says, decisions are made by those who show up. How do we make sure the right people show up? We need to have the innovators who are actually excited about using Python coming up with the great ideas to develop this stuff. Django, like most open source projects, is driven by volunteers. If an open source project is successful, their volunteers get found, they get better jobs, which keeps them busy, which means they walk away from the project because they're too busy, which means you've then lost your volunteers. So, like I was talking about yesterday, building the community, I think as an open source, even broader than Python, as an open source community, we have an issue with working out how to get the cool things actually paid for. Some of this stuff, to be practical, must come out of actual commercial applications to be extracted. But if someone has a cool idea, and everyone agrees it's a cool idea, and then they've got to abandon their cool idea because no one's paying for it, then we all lose as a community. So we need to work out amongst ourselves how we can identify the great people, the great innovators, and give them the resources to keep innovating. Now, Git tip, I like the idea behind Git tip. I would like to see it succeed, but it's not, taking the world by storm. It's possibly just going to be a slow growth by accretion. But that can't be the only solution we have. We need innovative ideas for how to make this stuff happen. But it's not all doom and gloom. We have achieved, it's important to remember, we have achieved an amazing amount of progress, an amazing amount of work with volunteer efforts. And these volunteers will continue to volunteer because it's a fun thing to do. I work in Django because I like tinkering. It's a fun thing for me to do that beats watching soap operas. So I'm not going to stop contributing to open source. There are challenges that I think could make the open source community so much more powerful and so much more useful to everyone. We have made great things. We have built great things. And to borrow from NASA's motto, per aspera ad astra, through adversity comes greatness. From adversity to the stars. So yes, it's hard work, but nothing worthwhile is ever easy. And now if you've got any questions about where Django's going or where you think any of this stuff is going.
Some questions? No?
Okay. Yeah, I have to direct everyone to my blog about asking questions at conferences, don't I?
You told us about backward compatibility.
Yes.
And you're afraid to work with this. But let's say it's Drupal. It's a PHP CMS, CMF, and every release of Drupal broke compatibility. But it's still growing. We see a lot of websites, huge websites, like NASA, for example, and it uses Drupal. Why are you afraid?
It's not that we're afraid of it, it's a set of engineering decisions. And breaking backwards compatibility is not a be-all or end-all. It is an engineering choice, and it's an engineering choice that the core team, because I have spent enough time maintaining long-term systems that I don't want to have to go back and every time, in order to get custom user models, I want to just get custom user models, not have to deal with all the crap of fixing all the other backwards compatibility issues. And that in itself is a reason why it's been popular in certain areas. NASA uses Drupal. Yes, they do. I can't deny NASA uses Drupal, but NASA also uses Django. And when you're selling to an engineering manager, when you're selling to someone, particularly at those high-level corporate ends, being able to say, we've got a backwards compatibility policy, and you're going to have a 2-year lead time warning that anything breaks, that's a selling point. That's something you can sell to a manager as why Django is better than Drupal. And I don't think it's something we want to give up, because it's inconvenient. We can't have a new shiny thing.
But it gives you progress.
It gives us some challenges. Like I said, there is a point at which practicality kicks in, and we may be forced to break backwards compatibility. But essentially the discussion, we would prefer the discussion to start with the assumption that we're not going to explore all the options of how we could possibly do this without breaking backwards compatibility, and then as a last resort break with backwards compatibility. Good example of this is the URL tag, which has essentially gone live in 1.5. When 1.0 came out, there was a ticket lingering, and I was sort of a little bit too distracted to actually pay attention to it because the URL tag didn't parse its content the same way as every other tag did, which meant that you couldn't use a variable as the argument to a URL, curly URL argument. And when 1.0 came out, I remember having a discussion with a couple of people that sort of said, oh, bugger, we'll just have to wait till 2.0. It's annoying, we're going to have to break backwards compatibility, we'll just, whatever. When Django 1.3 came around, we worked out a way to make it happen. We worked out that what you can do is load, because of the way that the template tag loader works, you can play a little trick on it and essentially load the base URL tag and then load another URL tag over the top of it as an opt-in. So essentially it's the equivalent of Python's from future, but being done through a template technique. So letting yourself simmer on the idea that you can't break backwards compatibility sometimes leads you to some interesting ideas for how you can actually get forwards compatible warnings of evolutionary change. Yes?
Is there any developers working on Django on full-time? And if no, it is problem is proposal of money, of lack of money, or there is no developers who wish to work on Django on full-time? And can we help this?
Okay, so it's a little bit of chicken and egg. So there is a little bit of both of those problems going on. There is an issue in that the Django, the DSF, doesn't currently have enough money to put on a developer full-time to develop something. We also, there is no single Django developer whose job is working on Django. Okay, so that is actually a problem that we have in that. You know, release management takes time. It takes a lot of effort, and take it from someone. I did the 1.3, 1.2, 1.3 releases. It's back-breaking, mind-numbing work. Would it be good to have someone who was being paid to be a release manager? Absolutely. We don't currently have the money to pay someone to do that. There are some people in the Django community who might be willing to do it, and at the very least, we have a couple of people who are in the core team who work for consulting organisations that the DSF could contract to say, okay, we're going to give consulting company X so many $1,000s to buy this developer's time for 2 days a week to manage the 1.5 release cycle, for example. But then in order to do that, in order to make that promise, we need to raise the money. So there's kind of we haven't got the model in place yet to work out how to ask for the money and what we ask for, other than just sort of saying, hey, we'd like some cash, which is kind of the model we're in at the moment. I've been having some very interesting discussions with Holger about the ways that PyConRu has been managing this process and getting funding to develop new features. And it may be a matter of the DSF coming with a much more focused. We are almost like a Kickstarter. We are raising funds to add app loading or app refactor to Django's core. We think it is 2 months worth of engineering effort. Everybody into your pockets. Give us your check. Yeah. So that seems like something that might be possible. It's just a matter of us organising it. We don't have the infrastructure in place to do that right now. And sort of the first one is always the hard one. And on top of that, no one on the DSF is paid to work full-time on the DSF either. So we've kind of got, does anyone want to give me money so that I can organise and getting people more money to, yeah, but that's something I'm hoping to look at over the next couple of months. It seems like it's an approach that may have some legs. So.
Могу на русском вопрос задать, или здесь
Появление Django было продиктовано, ее первоначальное направление, как вы вчера рассказывали, было продиктовано потребностями издательского дела. И все ее основные фишки и удачные моменты решения были как раз продиктованы необходимостью и рамками ресурсов всевозможных. Мне вопрос в том, нет, сможете перейти? Вопрос в том, существуют ли сейчас некоторые существенные такие факторы, влияющие, которые определяют и сподвигают к новым, именно ключевым каким-то решениям в развитии, в продолжении развития Django. В ближайших версиях, как в том числе и на будущее.
Yes, absolutely.
I will translate the question for you. The Django features was driven by use cases where a publishing company, publishing business, now Django is wide used by very different use cases. So what are the main use cases now that drive Django features?
Okay, so yes, absolutely true. The Django 1.0 came out of a publishing house and was very much driven by essentially Ellington, which was the commercial CMS on top of Django, the layer for building it. However, that hasn't been the case for a long time. There are a lot of other companies, a lot of other projects that are now built on top of Django, everything from social networks to data management companies to, to analytics companies. There is a wide range of products that are being built on top of Django. So those, we have a broader base of companies and interests that are driving the features that are coming in. Yeah, I suppose the area that, what we don't necessarily have, the only features we know that we're going to add are the ones that people have come to us and said, hey, we want to add them. I can't say I'm aware of any feature that we've said we won't add because it won't be good for a newspaper organisation. There are features that we don't add because they would be easier to manage outside of core, or keeping the Django's core small is something we want to do, because the smaller it is, the easier it is for us to manage. So a lot of the, we don't have, not that I'm aware of, any features that someone has said that we've rejected because it won't work for publishing. It's just getting features from any idea that comes in, if it looks like it will fit into Django's broader framework of an object model, a forms framework that wraps around it, and a mechanism for getting a request to turn into a response. All of those things, sort of, that's really the prime model. Does this new idea fit into that model? Does that make sense or answer the question?
Нет.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
А теперь основным источником фичей является комьюнити. Является могучую почту, говорит, чего надо.
One more question. When Google is releasing one more programming language in last year, it's no surprise to anyone. But when small company which makes newspaper is making such huge contribution to open source, it's well, it's not common, and I think that the company where Django was born is something like special. It's not like others. And can you tell more about what company is it and how management of that company affects
that decision to open source?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you convince, you work for a small company, how do you convince your boss to open source the tool that you're using?
And just in general, because in small companies it is usual just to work on current tasks, but not to think about the future on 10 years like you did.
Oh, okay. So I'm thinking about the long term because I like looking into crystal balls is fun. So the way that you convince your boss is to not try and make any sort of moral argument or any sort of philosophical argument. You make a pure engineering argument. The reason the journal world outsourced, the reason Journal World split out Django as an open source product is that what that allowed them to do for a very small engineering outlay of organising their code in a way that other people could use it and documenting what they were doing, they acquired a room full of people who will do work for them. Now, that's obviously not going to happen with every open source project, but do you know the origin? You know the Apache web server? Yeah. Do you know the origin of the name?
Yes, it was a...
The name comes from, it is Apache web server. It is a web server made up out of patches on top of the NCSA Mosaic web server. And the reason it's successful is because someone decided, I've got a web server here, and put it in open source. And someone else said, I'd like a slightly different feature on that web server. And now both of them have a web server with a new feature. So by putting it out there, you don't necessarily know whether your tool is going to get picked up by someone else. But what you've done is you've given the flexibility for someone else to help you. So they don't have to reinvent exactly the same wheel. They can help you, you can help them, and both of you together, it's not a zero-sum game. You both benefit from that project being open sourced. Now the other thing you can do is even if no one else uses your open source project, you go to that trouble and you open source it, you put up a project, you put up a web page, and you have no interest. It forces a really strong engineering discipline on you, because you can't have an internal API that you just, oh well, I'll just call across that API, because it needs to be published in that project for you to access it. Okay, so it forces really good compartmentalization, really good cohesion of your logic. You have to think about, what is this project doing? What does it mean? What is an extension API in this project? So completely aside from the benefits of having someone else work on your project for you for free, and you getting the benefit of that extra engineering effort, you internally have to make an engineering decision that we're going to build better engineered products, which is, that is ultimately a long-term, any company that doesn't want to have better internal engineering quality is kidding themselves in the long game. Now, particularly if this is something that is a core part of your business. Yeah, the moral and philosophical arguments on top of that just all nice, bring on top of the whole story.